The Black P. Stones are more than just a street group. They're a force that shaped entire cities and ignited battles that still burn today. In this video, we're revealing the most dangerous figures to ever emerge from their ranks. These are the people whose names sparked fear, whose decisions altered lives, and whose reach stretched far beyond the streets. We'll uncover their rise to power, their impact, and the legacy they left behind. Get ready for an intense journey into the lives of the people who not only controlled the streets, but challenged the entire system. You won't want to miss this. Number 6, T. Rogers. T. Rogers was born in the tough neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, specifically on 47th Street. Like many young men of his time, he found himself in a turbulent environment that offered limited opportunities for success. When he was just 12 years old, his mother moved the family to the Baldwin Hills area of Los Angeles, an area that had once been a middle-class haven for African Americans, but had grown to be associated with violence and street crime. This area, known as the Jungles, would play a pivotal role in shaping Rogers' future. Rogers' early exposure to the streets was deeply influenced by the Chicago-based Blackstone Rangers, one of the most powerful and organized street groups of the 1960s. The Blackstone Rangers later evolved into the almighty Black P. Stone Nation, a large community-centered organization at its inception. With the permission of the main 21 leaders of the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago, Rogers was granted authority to establish a West Coast chapter of the almighty Black P. Stone Nation in Los Angeles. It was here, in the Jungles, that Rogers rose to prominence, building a reputation as a feared and respected leader. Under Rogers' leadership, the West Coast chapter of the Black P. Stones quickly grew, numbering over 500 members. The group's activities, however, became more organized and dangerous over time. Rogers employed a more calculated, structured approach, unlike many of the disorganized street groups of the era. The gang thrived in its neighborhood, growing rapidly and asserting control over the streets. Rogers' influence extended beyond just the streets. He navigated gang culture with a careful mix of charisma and authority, which made him both revered and feared. T. Rogers' involvement in criminal activities was undeniable. The streets of Los Angeles were rife with illegal dealings, and under his command, the Black P. Stones were no exception. The group engaged in various forms of smuggling, trafficking substances, and other unlawful operations which contributed to the rise in violence in the area. His ability to organize and direct these operations solidified his reputation as a formidable leader. Despite his notoriety, Rogers was never content with just being labeled a gang leader. His life took many turns, and after years of street involvement, he shifted his focus toward community efforts. In 1975, seeing the chaos and violence around him, he founded Sidewalk University, an initiative designed to curb street violence and give young people an alternative path. T. Rogers lived many lives: street legend, actor, humanitarian, and community leader. His ability to navigate between these worlds was a witness to his adaptability and influence. He was a father and a grandfather, and he always believed that his legacy should be more than just his association with the Black P. Stones. He wanted to be remembered for the impact he had in uplifting his community, not just for his dangerous past. Rogers passed away at the age of 64. Number 5. Kenton Taylor. Kenton Taylor, known as the Prince, was a high-ranking member of the Black P. Stones Nation, established a fearsome reputation as a leader in Michigan. The Black P. Stones Nation, originally founded in Chicago, is a notorious gang with a long history of violence and illegal activities. In Michigan, Taylor was recognized as one of the top leaders of the gang's Lansing branch, earning his nickname, the Prince. His involvement in crime, particularly in illegal substances and violence, painted him as a dangerous figure both in the streets and in the criminal justice system. Taylor's criminal history stretches back over 2 decades, marked by frequent confrontations with law enforcement. His position within the Black P. Stones afforded him power, and with that, came responsibility for orchestrating illicit operations, mainly focused on substance trafficking. After serving a 5-year sentence in state prison for distributing substances, Taylor wasted no time returning to a life of crime. Following his release in 2012, he expanded his influence by running a distribution network that brought substances from Chicago to Lansing, Michigan. He and his associates, armed with weapons, frequently made trips between the two cities to maintain their supply and spread their influence across the region. He didn't just direct the operation, he enforced discipline within the gang. Taylor was known to order beatings of members who failed to follow the gang's rules, making sure everyone in the organization understood the consequences of stepping out of line. One particularly telling story occurred in 2013 when Taylor was suspected of organizing a retaliatory attack on an individual who had cooperated with law enforcement. The man was shot 5 times but survived the attack, an incident that highlighted the extreme measures Taylor and his associates were willing to take to silence those who threatened their operation. This wasn't Taylor's only run-in with violence. His role as the Prince of the Black P. Stones meant he was deeply involved in conflicts and retaliations typical of gang life. Taylor's operations extended beyond substances to weapons trafficking. Law enforcement officials, including the FBI and ATF, collaborated with local authorities to investigate Taylor's organization, eventually linking him and his associates to numerous criminal activities. In January 2014, authorities finally closed in on Taylor and his associates. Taylor, along with Carl Alfonso Lockridge, Maurice Ray Jr., and Eric Darnell Cooper, were charged with conspiracy to distribute substances and trafficking. Taylor, however, refused to take a plea deal like the others, opting instead to face trial. In a court case that would expose the inner workings of his operation, Taylor was convicted by a jury. His involvement in the distribution of over 100 grams of substances was enough to earn him a significant sentence. U.S. District Judge Janet Neff sentenced Taylor to over 12 years in federal prison, with an additional 8 years of supervised release once his term expires. The court case revealed not only Taylor's leadership in the gang, but also his willingness to resort to violence and intimidation to maintain control. Taylor's influence within the Black P. Stones extended to his family as well. His wife, Tiffany Morgan Taylor, defended him publicly, claiming that he was a man of good morals who had moved his family from Chicago to escape its violent environment. She painted a different picture of Taylor, one of a man who was inspirational to children and committed to peace. However, the court saw through this portrayal, focusing on the numerous criminal acts he was involved in and the danger he posed to society. As of 2024, he remains under federal supervision after his release, given his extensive involvement in organizing heroin distribution networks across Michigan and Illinois, which were connected to the Black P. Stone Nation's operations. Number 4. Cedron Doles. Cedron Shootashels Doles was a Southside Chicago rapper associated with the Black P. Stones, a gang deeply entrenched in the city's violent drill music scene. As a prominent member of the Black Mob, a faction of the Black P. Stones, Doles used his music not only as a platform for his creative voice, but also as a weapon in ongoing feuds with rival gangs. In 2017, Doles made waves in Chicago's drill scene with his diss track, Death of 150. This controversial song directly taunted members of the No Limit 150 faction, another gang tied to the Black P. Stones, making references to deceased gang members in an aggressive and provocative manner. This was not just music, but a dangerous taunt aimed at rivals in a long-standing feud between the two factions. Doles rapped about the deaths of No Limit members, like Jamal Harris, Jacoby Herring, and Fazan Robinson, fueling the hostility that had already claimed so many lives on both sides. The provocative nature of Doles's lyrics was a reflection of the gang culture surrounding him. He wasn't just a rapper. His music was deeply tied to the retaliatory violence that dominated Chicago's streets. The FBI and Chicago police had already been investigating the ongoing conflict between Black Mob and No Limit for years. As his music escalated the tension, Doles became a visible target in this deadly cycle. Cedron Doles was no stranger to the streets. His lyrics often mirrored the reality he lived in, and that reality was marked by violence and a constant threat of retaliation. His affiliation with the Black P. Stones, especially his role within the Black Mob, placed him in the crosshairs of rival gangs. Even outside of his music, Doles was involved in gang-related activities, contributing to the never-ending feud that claimed lives over and over again. His dangerous reputation as a gang member and rapper blended together. On the morning of July 10, 2017, Doles' life came to a brutal end. As he was about to enter his car in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood, 3 assailants exited a white Nissan Altima and opened fire. The attackers shot him multiple times, hitting him in the head, chest, arms, and legs, leaving him fatally wounded in the street. The police later recovered 43 shell casings from the scene, a grim indication of the targeted nature of the attack. His demise was a clear act of retaliation, a continuation of the violent cycle he had been part of both on the streets and through his music. In the months leading up to his demise, Doles had been increasingly vocal about the violence in his community, even acknowledging in a YouTube interview that the violence wouldn't stop unless serious efforts were made to reconcile. However, the deadly nature of Chicago's gang wars made such reconciliation unlikely. Doles was fully aware of the risks, but his music and affiliations kept him entrenched in the same world that eventually took his life. Despite the brutal nature of his demise, the case remains unsolved. No one has been charged for the assassination, though it is widely believed that his demise was a direct result of his ongoing feud with the No Limit faction. The FBI's investigation into the feud between Black Mob and No Limit was ongoing at the time of his demise, and authorities believed his slaying was a targeted effort. Number 3. Charles Edward Bay. Charles Edward Bay was once a significant figure in the history of Chicago's street gang culture, rising to prominence as the right-hand man of Jeff Fort, the notorious leader of the Black P. Stones. Bay's early life was marked by deep involvement in criminal activities that solidified his reputation as a dangerous individual. Alongside Jeff Fort, Bay helped the Blackstone Rangers evolve into a powerful entity, eventually receiving a $1 million federal anti-poverty grant in the late 1960s. Although this grant was meant for educational purposes, it became clear that the funds were misused. Bay and others were convicted of mismanaging the money, though he avoided prison time for this particular crime. Bay's name became synonymous with violence on the streets, earning a notorious reputation for being a formidable and dangerous figure. Despite his arrests in connection to several violent incidents, Bay was rarely convicted. One such event was the 1970 ambush of Chicago police officer James Alfano. Although Bay was arrested for his involvement in the officer's demise, he was never convicted. In 1986, Bay himself was targeted in an attack. He was shot in what was believed to be an attempt to eliminate him, likely by a rival in the city's narcotics world, specifically Willie Fluky Stokes, a prominent South Side illicit substance leader. Despite the severity of his injuries, Bay survived the attack, only to be implicated later that same year in the eventual end of Stokes, who was found shot just 3 months after Bay's own injury. Bay was arrested in connection with Stokes' end, but was never charged. Bay's criminal career, however, was not without personal risk. He had spent years dodging demise in prison, and by the late 1980s, his physical wounds began to catch up with him. His street legend remained strong, but the violence he had both inflicted and endured left scars. Despite this, Bay's later years showed a remarkable transformation. By the late 1990s, something in him shifted. He made a dramatic public apology for his past life, standing in front of a church congregation on the south side of Chicago and expressing remorse for his past actions. This moment was a key turning point in his life, as those who knew him closely noticed a genuine desire to make amends. Despite his reputation as a hardened individual, he spent the last years of his life trying to repair the damage he had once caused, earning the respect of many in his community. Yet, in a witness to life's unpredictability, Bay's journey came to a peaceful end in 1998 when he passed away from natural causes at the age of 67. More than 700 people gathered at St. Andrew's Temple on Chicago's South Side for his funeral, an evidence to the impact he had on those around him in his later years. His passing, in many ways, was the final chapter in a life marked by contradictions. A feared enforcer who, in the end, sought redemption. Number 2. Eugene Hairston. Eugene Hairston, known on the streets as King Bull, was one of the co-founders of the Black P. Stones. Hairston's leadership style was harsh and commanding, earning him the title of Big Chief. His charisma and street influence made him a natural leader, and under his guidance, the Black P. Stones grew rapidly. By 1965, the group expanded to over 5,000 members, with Hairston maintaining tight control. Despite his initial goal to uplift his community, Hairston's ambitions led him to engage in a range of illegal activities, particularly those that could bring in large profits. One of the most significant moments that shaped Hairston's dangerous reputation came in 1966. Hairston was involved in a highly organized operation involving the distribution of illegal substances. His involvement in this operation caught the attention of law enforcement, leading to his arrest in June of that year. He was charged with conspiracy and sentenced to federal prison. This marked the beginning of Hairston's long battle with the law, which he would never fully escape. While serving time, Hairston's power struggle with Jeff Fort intensified. Both leaders had their eyes on total control of the Black P. Stones. The gang, which had splintered into smaller factions, was deeply divided between followers of Fort and those loyal to Hairston. Hairston's group, the Titanic Stones, attempted to rival Fort's influence, but the split caused internal turmoil that weakened both sides. Even behind bars, Hairston continued to play a central role in the gang's activities. His ability to command loyalty from the younger members, as well as his deep connections with older criminal syndicates, allowed him to keep a stronghold on parts of the gang's operations. He acted as a middleman between the younger, street-level members and the more seasoned players in the underground economy. Hairston's violent conflicts with rivals and authorities continued after his release. He remained involved in the same lucrative operations that had landed him in prison, a choice that would eventually lead to his downfall. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, his criminal activities caught up with him again, leading to further legal troubles. By 1988, Eugene Hairston's time as a leader was nearing its end. That year, Hairston was fatally wounded in what appeared to be an internal dispute within his gang. His demise marked the conclusion of his reign as one of Chicago's most feared and respected figures. Number 1. Jeff Fort. Jeff Fort, born on February 20, 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi, became a dominant figure in Chicago's criminal underworld. His journey from a troubled youth to a feared leader began in the streets of Chicago's South Side. Fort, along with Eugene "Bull" Hairston, formed the Blackstone Rangers in the late 1950s. This small gang quickly grew, gaining influence across neighborhoods. By 1965, Fort had already shown an uncanny ability to unite rival groups under his leadership. His reputation earned him the nickname Angel, ironically in light of the rising wave of illegal activities the gang would soon be involved in. The Blackstone Rangers, later known as the Black P. Stone Nation, grew into a formidable force, absorbing other crews and forming a structured organization. Fort positioned himself as the group's primary leader after Hairston's imprisonment in 1966. By this time, Fort's ambitions extended beyond simple street disputes. Under his direction, the Black P. Stones became a community force, operating in a strange duality, engaging in both social welfare and illegal activities. Through alliances with local religious leaders and politicians, Fort was able to secure federal anti-poverty grants, supposedly to fund community uplift programs. But instead of using these funds as intended, Fort and his gang redirected them for their own purposes. This marked one of his first major run-ins with the law when he was indicted for misusing government funds in 1972. His refusal to cooperate with a Senate investigation underscored his defiance of authority, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While serving time in Leavenworth, Fort's life took another turn. He converted to Islam, adopting the name Abdul Malik Kaba. Upon his release in 1976, he rebranded his organization, now calling it the El Rukn tribe. The group publicly framed itself as a religious order under the Moorish Science Temple. But beneath the spiritual veil, El Rukn expanded its reach into illegal enterprises, with Fort still in control. Under Fort's leadership, El Rukn trafficked substances, operated protection schemes, and wielded considerable power in Chicago. They purchased properties and expanded their network, which extended to family, friends, and various associates. By the late 1970s, Fort had transformed El Rukn into a feared organization, with headquarters dubbed the Fort in the city's south side. Despite his conversion and religious persona, Fort's criminal activities continued. In 1983, he was arrested for trafficking substances and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Even behind bars, his influence remained potent. Fort continued to control El Rukn through secretive communication, using coded telephone calls. His ambitions now reached beyond Chicago's streets and even crossed national borders. In the mid-1980s, Fort and his group allegedly began conspiring with a foreign power, promising to carry out violent acts in exchange for financial backing and weapons. The plan was uncovered during an undercover sting operation, and Fort was once again indicted, this time on charges of conspiracy. His plot to commit attacks inside the U.S. in exchange for financial support landed him another 80-year sentence in 1987. Fort was convicted not only for conspiring with foreign agents, but also for orchestrating acts of extreme violence against rivals. By the late 1980s, Fort's criminal empire began to crumble. His continued leadership from behind bars led to another conviction in 1988, when he was sentenced to 75 more years for orchestrating violent offenses. With consecutive sentences piling up, Fort was isolated from his associates, first in USP Marion and later in ADX Florence, Colorado, one of the most secure prisons in the United States. He remains incarcerated to this day, continuing to serve a total sentence of 168 years.